The neon lights of the abandoned club flickered as a group of 6 friends entered, ready to live-stream the latest viral sensation, the Last Dance Challenge. It was simple, really: dance to a single track, play it to the end, and win. The night was theirs, or so they thought. The friends laughed as the distorted music pulsed through the speakers, each beat feeling more hypnotic than the last. As the group swayed to the rhythm, they felt as if something was moving in sync with them, hidden in the shadows. The music grew louder, more distorted, sending chills through the room. Then, without warning, the doors slammed shut. The friends froze, a heavy sense of dread settling over them as an ominous voice crackled over the speakers: "Welcome to the last dance. Only one can win." Suddenly, the lights dimmed, casting long, sinister shadows. Before they could react, a figure emerged from the darkness, cloaked and masked, holding a brutal tool with jagged edges. A scream pierced the air as he swung, slicing through one of the friends in a spray of blood, their limbs torn and twitching on the ground. Panic erupted. They tried to run, but the exits were all locked. The killer advanced, his movements perfectly timed to the beat of the relentless music, each swing a brutal choreography of violence. He seemed to feed off their terror, his weapon glinting under the red lights as he mutilated each friend in a sickening dance of carnage, one by one. The friends fell, each step of their dance more gruesome than the last. Skin peeled from bone, screams layered with the pulsing beat, and the walls dripped red. The last survivor, drenched in their friend's blood, stumbled toward the exit, only to realize the killer had saved the final, most horrific act for them. The music stopped. A sinister laugh echoed as the final survivor looked into the killer's mask and saw their own reflection in his blood-stained blade. With one final, agonizing slice ended, along with their lives, the last 7 friends ventured into the club that night, a tight-knit group with complex ties. There was Marcus and Rachel, who'd been secretly in love with each other since high school, their passion simmering beneath the surface, visible to everyone but them. Among the group were also Amelia, the wild, rebellious one, and Jake, her best friend, always sticking by her side with a mysterious gleam in his eye. Lucas, the thrill-seeker, had dared everyone to come to the abandoned club and join the Last Dance Challenge. He brought his younger sister Lily, eager to prove she could keep up. Finally, there was Brent, their oldest friend, stoic and silent, whose feelings for Rachel had always been unrequited. When the doors locked and the night took a sinister turn, panic set in, but the group instinctively huddled together, desperately trying to come up with a plan to survive. As the music filled the room and the masked killer made his terrifying entrance, the horror in their eyes began to mix with something deeper, something visceral that both connected and tore them apart. The distorted beats pulsed in time with their hearts, each sound filling the air with an unnatural tension. The lights flickered, casting a shadowy glow that seemed to accentuate Rachel's fear and vulnerability. She found herself pressing closer to Marcus, the adrenaline of survival amplifying their suppressed desire. Their eyes met, both acknowledging that, if these were their last moments, they'd regret never having expressed what they'd felt all along. A brutal scream from across the room ripped them back to the horrors around them. Lucas had been cornered, his hand crushed under the masked killer's boot. The blood oozed as he gasped in pain, the killer looming over him, savoring every moment of his helplessness. Yet, amidst the chaos, as Lucas pleaded, Rachel and Marcus's instincts were to stay hidden, as if alone in a terrible dance of Rachel's eyes only heightened Marcus's need to protect her, yet there was something dark in the way she clung to him, seeking his strength with an intensity neither had felt before. Hidden in the shadows, they pressed against each other, and Marcus couldn't help but let his lips brush against hers, the electric thrill of the kiss amplifying the terror surrounding them. Elsewhere, Amelia, Jake, and Brent fought to remain calm, though their emotions were just as charged. Amelia's wild defiance had always thrilled Jake, and now, cornered and terrified, she held on to him tightly, their faces close, hearts pounding. The killer watched, his masked gaze settling on their intertwined forms as he seemed to revel in their fear. His twisted mind savoring the vulnerability turned attraction, the primal need for connection even in the face of death. One by one, their connections became bittersweet as each realized that, in their desperation to survive, they would do anything, even betray each other. The killer, known only as Madame V, was no ordinary figure of terror. In her prime, she was a renowned dancer, her elegance matched only by her lethal allure. Once, her name graced the stages of prestigious clubs and theaters. Her beauty and poise captivated audiences, leaving men and women alike spellbound. But her career, her fame, and her beauty were ripped away when an accident on stage left her disfigured. Betrayed by the very people she trusted, who abandoned her as soon as she lost her perfect face, Madame V's soul twisted into a dark, vengeful hunger. Now at 50, she moved like a deadly dancer across the room, her beauty resurfacing in the strength of her steps, her elegance a shroud to her monstrous intent. She wore a long, tattered red dress that hugged her body, exposing scars on her skin, reminders of the betrayal she suffered. Her eyes gleamed with a wicked desire for vengeance, and she wielded a deadly weapon, her fight sickle adorned with jagged teeth, crafted specifically to prolong agony. She had a ritual. Each dance, each kill was a macabre performance, a twisted choreography that only she knew. As the music swelled, she approached Lucas, bound and barely conscious, his gaze transfixed by her terrible beauty. She circled him, swaying her hips, letting her fingers trace along his skin with a touch so gentle it sent chills through him. She leaned close, her lips brushing his ear, whispering promises of freedom before dragging the serrated edge of her blade along his arm. Each cut was precise, each scream a twisted melody to her ears. Moving on, she found Jake and Amelia clinging to each other in terror. With a seductive smile, Madame V ran her fingers along Jake's face, tilting his chin up as if examining a prized possession. Her lips brushed his in a taunting kiss before she twisted her blade into his shoulder, savoring the agony that contorted his face. She licked the blood from her fingertips, her eyes never leaving Amelia, whose horror only seemed to fuel Madame V's sick pleasure. The others could do nothing but watch, entranced and horrified, as Madame V turned each execution into a perverse dance, reveling in every drop of fear and blood. As Madame V glided through the shadows of the club, her twisted elegance captivated what remained of the terrified group. She relished the power she held over them. The way their eyes darted, their breaths quickened, caught in a mix of horror and an almost hypnotic fascination. Her body, scarred yet somehow seductive, became a dark symbol of everything they feared and couldn't look away from. Each step, each graceful swing of her deadly sickle, was like a practiced move in a morbid dance. Marcus and Rachel huddled together, their eyes fixed on Madame V as she circled them. Madame V's gaze locked on Rachel, and with a slow, predatory smile, she knelt before the couple, running a cold, scarred finger along twisted intimacy in her touch, a seductive cruelty that left Rachel paralyzed, unable to tell if she was more terrified or entranced. Madame V's voice was a low, husky whisper, laced with dark promises. "You see," she said, leaning close to Rachel, "I'm giving you the freedom you crave. The thrill you've wanted, hidden beneath fear and desire." Madame V's hand drifted to Rachel's throat, her touch light as she traced the lines of her pulse with the blade, not cutting, but hinting, threatening. The feeling sent an unexpected shiver down Rachel's spine, her breath shallow, feeling Marcus's hand tighten in hers as Madame V's sickle edged closer. In the next instant, Madame V shifted to Marcus. Her gaze unwavering as she trailed her fingers across his chest, pressing against his heart. Her touch was oddly affectionate, a twisted mockery of love. She whispered, her breath hot against his skin, "You'd do anything to save her, wouldn't you?" Before he could answer, Madame V dug her blade just below his collarbone, slowly, deliberately. Marcus gritted his teeth, his face twisting in agony as Madame V watched with dark delight, savoring every reaction, every flinch. She ran her fingers through his blood, tracing it across Rachel's trembling lips in a perverse ritual, a bond forged in terror. Moving on, Madame V's eyes found Brent, who had remained frozen, silent in shock. She tilted her head, almost intrigued, and approached him with the grace of a lover. She brushed her lips across his cheek, a ghost of a kiss, her touch deceptively gentle as she whispered to him about his secret desires, the darkness he had kept hidden even from himself. Her words were poison, seeping into his mind, warping his fear into something twisted and haunted. She murmured, dragging her blade slowly across his chest, each movement precise, every inch calculated to prolong his pain and her pleasure. She fed on his confusion, the twisted blend of terror and fascination that danced across his eyes as she forced him to confront his own buried darkness. Madame V reveled in the psychological games, the raw emotions she stirred with every touch, every cruel word, each deliberate slice. She was more than a killer, she was a puppeteer, controlling her victim's emotions, twisting love, fear, and pain into a grotesque, erotic masterpiece. The club became her stage, and the blood-stained floor, her ballroom. Madame V circled her remaining victims with a sinister grace, her gaze locking onto each terrified face. She could feel their desperation, their tangled emotions, a heady mix of terror, betrayal, and morbid attraction to the dark power she wielded over them. To Madame V, their vulnerabilities were laid bare, their fears woven with a forbidden thrill they couldn't admit even to themselves. Rachel, trembling, tried to pull Marcus closer, but Madame V was already there, her body pressing into his, trapping him between her deadly allure and the brutal steel in her hand. She ran her fingers over his neck, tracing his pulse with a predatory smile. Leaning in close, her lips brushed his ear as she whispered, "How much of yourself would you give to save her?" Her words were laced with dark seduction. Each syllable an invitation to surrender, to submit. She pulled away just enough to meet Rachel's tear-filled gaze, locking her in place with a look both cruel and intimate. "Would you watch him suffer for you, Rachel? Would you let him bleed, just so you can feel safe for a moment longer?" Without waiting for an answer, Madame V dragged her blade slowly across Marcus's chest, each cut shallow but deliberate, leaving a trail of crimson. His gasps of pain filled V's dark eyes, flickered with satisfaction as she let his agony ripple through Rachel, her horror turning to helplessness. The bond between them only fueled Madame V's twisted pleasure. They were her instruments, each reaction another note in her orchestrated symphony of terror, but Madame V wasn't finished. She turned her attention to Amelia, who was huddled in the corner, her defiance now shattered, eyes wide with dread. Jake had tried to shield her, but Madame V swept him aside with effortless force, pinning Amelia beneath her piercing gaze. "You've always been the bold one, haven't you, Amelia?" Madame V murmured, her tone mocking. She caressed Amelia's face with one blood-stained hand, smearing crimson across her cheek as her blade traced down her arm, just shy of breaking the skin. "But everyone has a limit. Let's find yours, shall we?" Madame V's blade flashed, and in a calculated move, she began to carve intricate patterns into Amelia's skin, her motions precise, almost reverent. Amelia's strangled cries filled the room, each one fueling Madame V's dark satisfaction. Jake, pinned nearby, looked on in helpless horror, his face a portrait of twisted grief and fury as he watched Amelia's strength unravel. Madame V's voice was soft, almost tender, as she leaned close to Amelia's ear. "You see, pain is a kind of art. And you, my dear, are my masterpiece." But the real horror lay not in the pain itself, but in the way Madame V manipulated their minds. Her whispers filled the air, insidious and poisonous, turning each person's fear inward. She toyed with their deepest insecurities, their unspoken desires, peeling back the layers of their defenses until all that remained was raw, exposed terror. When she reached Brent, who had once harbored secret feelings for Rachel, she made him a twisted offer, weaving her words with dark allure. "If you could have her, would you endure any torment? Would you trade your life for one?" Brent's mind reeled, torn between his love and the overwhelming fear coursing through him. Madame V used his hesitation to her advantage, dragging her blade slowly across his chest, savoring each tremor of pain as if coaxing out his secret desires, transforming them into something dark and forbidden. She leaned close, her lips grazing his skin, her voice barely a whisper. "Pain and pleasure, Brent. They're two sides of the same coin. All you have to do is surrender." With each brutal act, each twisted whisper, Madame V pulled her victims deeper into her macabre dance, binding them to her will, their helplessness her symphony, their terror her masterpiece. The dance floor became a canvas of blood and horror. An unholy stage where their souls hung by threads of fear and forbidden fascination, held captive to Madame V's lethal allure, and as the music rose to a haunting crescendo, they realized the truth: Madame V wasn't just killing them. She was transforming them into part of her story, each life a verse in her twisted tale, a dark romance bound by terror and blood. As the haunting music swelled through the abandoned club, Madame V moved like a dark siren, her steps weaving in and out of the shadows with deadly grace. Her eyes sparkled with wicked anticipation as she cast a slow, lingering gaze over the remaining survivors, savoring the look of dread and disbelief painted across their faces. She had broken their minds, stripped them of hope and defiance, and now they were mere instruments in her symphony of terror. Her gaze settled on Jake, who lay trembling on the floor, his resolve shattered after watching his friends fall one by one. She approached him, her movements slow, purposeful, each step a reminder that escape was futile. She knelt beside him, her cold fingers tracing over his bruised skin, her touch light but suffused with a cruel intimacy. Her voice was low, almost tender as she whispered, "Do you understand me, beautiful? But only when you surrender to it." Jake's eyes, glassy with pain, locked onto her, and he shuddered as her touch turned gentle, as if she were caressing a lover. Madame V took his hand and guided it to her scarred cheek, letting him feel the rough texture of her skin, each line a memory of betrayal and agony. She pressed his palm against her face, her eyes boring into his, challenging him to understand her twisted beauty. For a fleeting moment, his fear wavered, replaced by something darker, something primal. And Madame V reveled in it, but her sympathy was fleeting. With a quick, brutal twist of her blade, she slashed his wrist, savoring his scream as he fell back. Blood dripped down her fingers, and she painted it across her lips like crimson lipstick, her gaze never breaking from his. She whispered, "You look beautiful, darling," wrapped in pain. She turned to the others, her sickle gleaming under the dim light, and her eyes settled on Rachel, who clung desperately to Marcus's side. Rachel's wide, terrified eyes betrayed her inner turmoil, torn between her horror and the morbid allure Madame V's presence commanded. She held on to Marcus, but Madame V's dark allure was seeping into her mind, twisting her fear into something unrecognizable. "You love him, don't you?" Madame V's voice dripped with venomous amusement. "Would you let him die to save yourself? Or would you join him in his pain?" Rachel's voice wavered as she choked out a plea, but Madame V silenced her with a finger pressed against her lips. Her touch was icy, her smile cruel. "Let me show you what love really means," she murmured, dragging her sickle along Marcus's arm in a slow, deliberate line, letting the blood bead and torn between her horror and the magnetic pull of Madame V's dark allure. She was horrified by her own fascination, by the strange intimacy that had woven itself between predator and prey. Madame V saw this, feeding off it, a puppet master in a dance that blurred the line between pleasure and pain, fear and longing. She turned her attention to Brent, who had been paralyzed by fear, unable to look away as his friends fell into Madame V's grasp. She moved to him with slow, deliberate steps, her smile seductive and deadly. She leaned in close, brushing her lips against his neck, her breath hot against his skin. "Tell me, Brent," she whispered, her voice a mix of menace and seduction. "Do you fear me? Or desire me?" Brent's voice caught in his throat, his mind spiraling as he was trapped between conflicting emotions, his terror giving way to a twisted compulsion. Madame V toyed with his vulnerability, tracing her blade lightly along his skin, making him tremble in helpless anticipation. Her movements were a dance of cruelty and seduction, each step designed to draw her victims deeper into her web, blurring their fear with an unnatural pull they couldn't resist. She was a master of psychological torment, making them question their own reality, forcing them to confront the darkness that lay buried within themselves. For Madame V, this wasn't just about the kill, it was about transforming them. Using their fear and pain to create a twisted intimacy, a connection forged in blood and horror. She saw herself in their terror, their raw vulnerability reflecting the darkness she had embraced long ago. As she moved through the room, each remaining friend were bound to her now, lost in her dance of pain and ecstasy, victims of a twisted love affair with terror itself. The dim, flickering lights cast long shadows across the club, now a macabre stage for Madame V's twisted symphony. The few remaining survivors, Rachel, Marcus, and Jake, stood frozen, trapped in a twisted nightmare they could neither escape nor comprehend. Madame V circled them with lethal grace, each step punctuating the fragile silence that hung in the air like an omen, her eyes locked onto Rachel, whose trembling body betrayed her fear but also something more dangerous, resignation. Madame V's smile widened as she watched the struggle play out in her victim's eyes. She knew Rachel was breaking, teetering on the edge of surrender. The kind of surrender that would lead to her becoming part of Madame V's twisted dance. "You're so close, Rachel," Madame V cooed, her voice dripping with malicious sweetness. "I can see it in your eyes. The fight, the desire to survive. But you know, deep down, that the more you struggle, the more delicious the end will be." Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't look away from Madame V, who was almost hypnotic in her elegance. Every inch of the killer's body radiated control, over herself, over the room, over them, but just as Rachel opened her mouth to speak, something cold, sharp, and impossibly hard pressed against her throat. She gasped in surprise, looking down to see Madame V's sickle blade resting there, the glint of metal teasing her skin. "Do you know what it feels like to have your life hang by a thread?" Madame V whispered, her voice turning dark and soft. "The thrill, the power, the absolute control. The dance of life and death is so much more beautiful when you can feel every last moment." Rachel closed her eyes, trembling. Her heart thudded erratically in her chest as the sickle pressed deeper, a hint of blood spilling out to mix with the sweat that slicked. She had become entranced by the killer's presence, a part of her succumbing to the psychological torment, to the anticipation of what was to come. Fear and longing blurred together as the blade traced down her neck and over her collarbone, making her shudder. Behind her, Marcus and Jake, both broken by the carnage around them, stood motionless. Madame V had a way of making them forget their survival instincts, turning them into pawns, witnesses to their own demise. "Marcus," Madame V purred, her eyes flicking over to him as she circled Rachel. "You loved her, didn't you? You loved her enough to die for her, didn't you?" Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but the words never came. His body had become paralyzed by fear, and Madame V saw the flicker of his inner turmoil. The fear of pain, the fear of losing Rachel, and the subtle hint of desire for both her and the slow, torturous end she promised. Rachel's legs buckled beneath her as she fell to her knees, breaking the intense gaze she had locked with Madame V. The sickle twisted and dug deeper into her skin, a loud, wet sound that echoed in the air. She gasped in pain, a hot rush of blood spilling down her body, mixing with the cold sweat. Her body trembled violently, her breaths ragged as her mind began to splinter under the pressure of the pain and the killer's words. Madame V leaned closer to Rachel, her lips brushing her ear as she whispered, "You could stop this, you know. You could take my place. Become me. Just let go." Rachel's eyes widened in horror as Madame V's hands slid beneath her bloodied clothes. The killer's touch was almost affectionate, but it felt like an invasion, a perversion of the intimacy that had once been between Rachel and Marcus. "You think you can survive this, but the real question is, would you want to?" Rachel gasped as she felt the cold steel of Madame V's sickle traced dangerously close to her exposed flesh, sending a wave of terror through. The seductive yet malevolent tension swelled in the air, and the room seemed to pulse with a twisted energy, suffocating in its intensity. Meanwhile, Marcus's mind spun, filled with a storm of conflicting emotions, horror, guilt, and an unnerving fascination with the violence unfolding before him. He could barely breathe, barely think, his love for Rachel intertwined with his disgust and his helplessness. Madame V had broken them, all of them, mentally and emotionally, in ways they couldn't even begin to comprehend. But then, a twist, something none of them saw coming. In the midst of the chaos, the air in the room seemed to grow thick, oppressive, like the weight of an unseen presence had taken hold. Madame V's movement slowed, her eyes flickering for just a brief moment. And that's when Marcus saw it, an object that had been in a corner, obscured by shadows, now illuminated by the flickering light, an old, ornate mirror, cracked and stained with something dark. For a brief moment, Rachel's gaze flicked toward it. Her eyes went wide, a realization dawning on her. Madame V's power wasn't just physical, it was psychological. She had ensnared their minds, twisting their reality, feeding off their deepest fears and desires. But what if? What if they could turn the tables? Rachel's heart raced as she realized the truth. The mirror wasn't just an object, it was a trap. The room had shifted around them. A nightmare of psychological horrors that trapped them all in a distorted reflection of their own fears. The killer wasn't just torturing their bodies, she was warping their minds. Look at yourselves, Madame V hissed, her voice growing colder. You can't escape. Not from me. Not from this place. But Rachel, despite the blood, despite the pain, managed to break free of the hold that had gripped her mind. The mirror. It was their last hope. She made a desperate lunge for it, her blood-slick hands reaching for the She wasn't going to let Madame V control them anymore. The others seemed to follow suit. Jake, his breath still shallow and ragged, gathered what was left of his strength. Marcus, despite his horror, managed to stand, his eyes wild with terror and something else, a primal urge to survive. The mirror became their focal point, their escape route from the twisted maze that Madame V had created. Madame V watched them, amusement flickering in her eyes. You think you can escape me? You think you can escape your own desires? With one final, brutal slash of her sickle, she sent them all hurtling toward the mirror. Their bodies, battered and broken, collided with the glass, shards of reflection flying in all directions. As the pieces rained down, the room seemed to crack, the world splitting apart, and then, all was silent. The air was thick with the stench of blood, sweat, and something else, something darker. The room was a distorted reflection of itself, the walls pulsating as if alive. The shattered pieces of the mirror lay scattered across the floor, sharp shards glistening like jagged teeth, remnants of the last glimmer of hope that had shattered along with their minds. Rachel's fingers, slick with blood, trembled as she grasped at the fragments. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her body bruised and battered, but it wasn't just the physical pain that seared through her, it was the psychological torture that had been wrought upon them. The mirror had shown them their deepest fears, their darkest desires. Every crack in the glass reflected not just their outward wounds, but their very souls twisted and contorted by Madame V's sickening influence. Marcus stood frozen, his eyes wide, the terror paralyzing him even further. He could feel the weight of the killer's gaze upon him, but now, he realized, something had changed. The air in the room had shifted, the atmosphere had thickened. Madame V was no longer the only threat. Once smooth, now seemed to breathe. The floor beneath their feet seemed to shift as if alive, as if the very building was feeding off the terror that had filled it. There was something else in the room, something far older than Madame V, something that had existed in the shadows, waiting. Rachel's head snapped up. Her eyes locked with Marcus's, and for the briefest moment, she saw something shift in him, a flicker of recognition, of understanding. She was about to speak, but before the words could escape her lips, a low, guttural growl rumbled through the floor. It wasn't a human sound. The walls groaned, as if they were about to collapse, and for the first time, Rachel felt something cold. Something far more ancient and malevolent, pressing against her very being, and then the ground cracked beneath them, splitting open like the jaws of a beast, and they were all thrown into darkness. When they woke, they were no longer in the club. The world had shifted. No longer was the music playing, no longer was the sickle swinging. Instead, the room they found themselves in was dark, too dark, with only flickering candlelight casting grotesque shadows against the walls. The air was damp, thick with the scent of decay. The floor was cold, damp stone beneath them. As their eyes adjusted to the dim light, they saw the walls, lined with chains, shackles, and strange symbols etched into the stone. The silence in the room was oppressive, heavy with an unspoken dread. Marcus shook his head, disoriented, his body aching from the fall. He tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, sluggish, as if something was pressing against him. He glanced around and saw Rachel, her body still trembling, blood-streaked hair clinging to her face, her eyes wide with fear. Jake was there too, his chest rising and falling rapidly, sweat beading on his brow. "Where are we?" Rachel's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. Her words echoed in the empty space, amplifying the sense of death echoed through the chamber, sending a chill down their spines. It was familiar, yet different, a distortion of the laughter they had heard before. Madame V emerged from the shadows, her presence more intense than ever. She had changed, though. Her once calm composure was now tinged with something darker, something hungry. Her eyes gleamed with madness, her lips twisted into a smirk. "You've crossed over," she whispered, her voice dripping with malice. "You think you escaped? Think again. The dance isn't over. This is just the beginning." Rachel's pulse quickened as the full weight of Madame V's words crashed over her. Crossed over? What did that mean? The air around them felt heavier. Thicker, as if they were no longer part of the physical world. Something ancient, something powerful had taken hold of the space, and it was feeding on their fear. "You'll never leave this place," Madame V continued, stepping closer. "You are mine. All of you. Forever." Rachel backed away, her breath catching in her throat. The shadows around them seemed to writhe, as if they were alive, closing in on them. The walls seemed to close in too, the stone moving, shifting as if alive, pressing in from all sides. The temperature dropped suddenly, sending icy tendrils of fear creeping up Rachel's spine. Suddenly, Jake screamed. Rachel whirled around to see him thrashing against something in the darkness. His body spasmed, his limbs jerking violently. It was as though some invisible force was pulling at him, tearing him apart. His eyes rolled back, and his mouth opened in a silent scream, his body convulsing as blood began to pour from his eyes, nose, and mouth. Rachel's heart raced as she tried to run to him, but the ground beneath her feet seemed to give way, as if the very floor was consuming them. She stumbled, her legs giving way beneath her, and she was dragged back, her face scraping against the cold. V watched, her lips curled into a cruel smile, eyes alight with sadistic glee. "Do you see?" she cooed, her voice haunting. "The dance will never end. The torment never stops. I will carve your souls into the walls of this place, and you will be my partners for eternity." Rachel tried to scream, but her voice was lost in a cacophony of Jake's tortured wails and the shifting walls. The air was thick with the sound of flesh tearing, bones snapping, the wet, sickening crunch of bones breaking in unnatural ways. Suddenly, a figure stepped from the shadows. It was a tall, gaunt man, his face obscured by a mask, but his eyes glowed with an eerie, otherworldly light. In his hand, he held a jagged, rusted blade, nothing like the smooth sickle Madame V had used, but something far more grotesque, more visceral. Rachel gasped as she realized the truth. Madame V wasn't the only killer here. This place was a hellish hive of torment, where horrors were born, nurtured, and twisted into something far worse. The man raised the blade and stepped toward them, his presence overwhelming, suffocating. "Join the dance," he whispered, his voice a low, guttural sound that sent chills down her spine. And then, in the distance, the music began to play again, soft at first, a haunting melody that made Rachel's blood run cold. It was the same song from before, but now it sounded distorted. Warped, like it had been pulled from some ancient nightmare. The dance had begun again. And this time, there would be no escape. The air inside the room felt suffocating, like a vice squeezing the very breath out of Rachel's lungs. The cold stone walls seemed to close in on them with every passing second, warping and twisting, as if the place itself was alive, aware of their terror. The eerie music played on, growing louder, more distorted. The melody, once simple and playful, now felt like a sinister lullaby. It echoed through her skull, rattling her nerves, gnawing at her. Rachel's eyes darted around the chamber, her heart pounding as the shadows shifted, forming grotesque shapes that moved just beyond her line of sight. There was something else here, something much darker than Madame V. It was the feeling of being trapped in a nightmare, a place where time had no meaning and escape was a farce. Her gaze locked onto Jake's body, still twitching and spasming, his form now nothing more than a grotesque puppet pulled by unseen strings. His limbs jerked unnaturally, his skin stretched and contorted in ways that should have been impossible. Blood pooled around him, dripping from his mouth and eyes, his screams now a guttural rasp, drowning in the horrific symphony of pain. "Why?" Rachel whispered, choking on the words. Her own body trembled as she reached for him, but something pulled her back, an invisible force that held her in place. Her muscles burned, her bones aching with every moment of tension. It was as though the very walls were keeping her captive, preventing her from reaching the one person who might still be alive. Madame V's laughter broke the silence, a cruel, mocking sound that sent a shiver down Rachel's spine. She turned to face her, the woman's figure emerging from the darkness, her eyes gleaming with sadistic delight. The silver blade gleamed in her hand, its edge glinting as it reflected the flickering candlelight. Her smile was wide. Her lips painted in a wicked, blood-red hue. "It's already too late," Madame V purred, her voice dripping with malice. "You think you can escape the dance, but it's only just begun." Rachel's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest as she frantically searched for a way out. The chains on the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, their cold, rusted surfaces glinting like a warning. She tried to stand, but the ground beneath her seemed to shift, tilting and tilting until she was once again flat on her back. He let out a scream of pure desperation as Madame V stepped closer, the sound of her heels clicking on the stone floor like a death march. "You'll dance with me, Rachel," Madame V whispered, her voice like a lover's caress. "I've been waiting for you, you know." Rachel's eyes widened in terror, but before she could react, the world seemed to collapse in on itself. The walls stretched outwards, contorting into grotesque shapes, the shadows growing more monstrous. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, she thought she saw herself, her own reflection, standing behind Madame V, an expression of twisted lust on her face. The woman before her smiled, her lips curling in a wicked grin. "You're not the only one trapped here, darling," she cooed. "You're just like me now." Rachel's pulse quickened as the floor seemed to open up beneath her. She fell forward, her body dropping like a stone, until her face met the cold, slick surface of the floor. A sharp pain shot through her skull as her head collided with the stone, the world spinning into a vortex of confusion. When she lifted her head, the room had changed again. The walls were now alive, writhing with twisted faces, their mouths open in silent screams. Rachel recoiled in horror, her body trembling. The room pulsed with a sick, otherworldly energy, and she could feel it seeping into her skin, into her veins, crawling beneath her flesh. Something was wrong. Her hands reached for her head, her fingers trembling as she felt the hot, slick blood running down her forehead. But as she wiped the blood away, revealed themselves to be a grotesque mass of contorted human bodies. Faces stretched in silent screams, mouths wide in agony. The room itself was a trap, feeding off their fear, their pain. And as Rachel felt herself slipping away into darkness, she knew the truth. The world around Rachel spun, her consciousness teetering on the edge of oblivion. The rhythmic beat of the music continued its haunting pulse, but now it was a grotesque symphony. It played with her mind, bending time and space, as if mocking her every attempt to escape. The walls, once smooth and solid, now seemed to bleed. They pulsed with an unnatural life, throbbing like a giant, grotesque heart. Faces appeared in the stone. Grotesque and distorted, their eyes bulging with pain, their mouths open in eternal screams. The blood around her feet slowly inched closer, pooling at the base of her legs as if it had a mind of its own, creeping like a living entity, eager to devour her. Madame V stood at the edge of the chamber, watching with an eerie calmness. Her lips curled into a wicked smile as she observed Rachel's desperate, futile struggle. There was something almost loving in her gaze, like a predator relishing its prey's suffering. The silver blade gleamed in her hand, reflecting the flickering candlelight. "You can feel it now, can't you?" Madame V purred, her voice thick with satisfaction. "You're part of the dance." Rachel. All of you are. Every scream, every drop of blood, feeds the music. Feeds the hunger. You're mine now, body and soul. Rachel's breath was ragged, her body trembling as she tried to crawl away, but each movement felt like dragging her limbs through thick, viscous blood. It was as if the very air was made of agony, pulling her down, forcing her to submit. Every inch of her skin screamed in pain, a horrible sensation that twisted from the inside out. She reached for anything that could help her escape, but the walls seemed to pull away. Music swelled. Rachel caught sight of her reflection in one of the nearby mirrors. At first, she thought it was her imagination, the flickering candlelight making her see things. But no. It was her, but it wasn't. Her eyes were empty, hollowed out, her skin taut, stretched over her bones like a grotesque mask. She wasn't even human anymore. Her body had been twisted, transformed by the horrors of the room, the very place that had ensnared her soul. Her fingers were no longer delicate, but cruel, jagged claws that scraped against the stone floor as she moved. No. Rachel screamed, her voice raw. She looked at Madame V, her eyes filled with a mixture of terror and rage. What have you done to me? Madame V's laugh was a haunting melody, full of mockery. She moved closer to Rachel, her heels clicking against the stone floor like a countdown to death. It's not just about killing, she whispered, the edge of the blade trailing lightly against Rachel's skin. It's about becoming. Becoming part of the dance, part of the darkness. It's about breaking down the boundaries of the flesh, of the soul. With a flick of her wrist, Madame V slashed the blade across Rachel's stomach, the force of it sending a jolt of agony through her. Blood spilled out in a sickening cascade, staining the floor. Rachel gasped, her body going rigid in shock and pain as the room seemed to shift again, warping around her. The walls pulsed in rhythm with the music, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to sway like a dance floor, pulling her deeper into the nightmare, and then, with sickening clarity, Rachel understood. It was a game. A sick game. The killer didn't just want her death, she wanted her transformation. She wanted her body to become something grotesque, a part of the dance, a puppet to her twisted desires. Madame V knelt down beside her, her face close to Rachel's, her breath warm and heavy on her skin. Don't fight it, she whispered, her voice low and seductively soft. It'd take you. You'll never escape it. You'll never escape me. Rachel's body spasmed as Madame V's hand brushed against her ruined skin, her fingers tracing the jagged cut she had made. The touch was maddening, both painful and erotic in its intensity. It was as if the pain itself was pleasure, a sick dance of agony and lust. Rachel's body betrayed her, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the sensation sent shudders of fear and twisted desire through her. No, she gasped, her mind struggling to hold on to any shred of resistance. She couldn't feel this, not now, not when everything inside her screamed for survival. But Madame V's hand was insistent, her grip tightening like a vice as she pulled Rachel closer. The room around them seemed to warp again, the shadows bending and stretching, until Rachel was surrounded by twisted, faceless bodies, all swaying to the music, all lost in the same torment. The killer's voice whispered in her ear again, soft and intimate, you see? We're all part of it now. This place, it takes everything from you. Your body. Your mind. Your soul. Rachel screamed, but her body responded differently, jerking with horrific, unnatural movements. The blood seemed to burn as it flowed from her, mingling with the pain and terror. The walls closed in again, tightening like a noose around her neck. The music was unbearable now, a cacophony of dissonant sounds that sent her mind into a spiral of madness. And then, as if summoned by some unholy force, the others appeared, their bodies mangled and deformed, still twitching, their eyes empty but alive with a grotesque hunger. The floor opened up beneath them, the bodies rising as if from the pits of hell itself. Their faces were a warped reflection of Rachel's own, twisted, elongated, their features stretched beyond recognition. They were her future, her fate. They were the ones who had once danced, and now they were trapped, forever part them. Madame V whispered, as she leaned in close again, her lips brushing Rachel's ear. "You're ready. You're already one of us." Rachel's scream died in her throat, choked by the blood that poured from her wounds. The air was thick with the scent of decay, of bodies rotting, of flesh that could never heal. The dance continued, but there was no more joy in it, only suffering. Only the unending, twisted rhythm of pain. The silence that followed the final note of the music was suffocating. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, but a heavy, oppressive stillness that seemed to crush Rachel's chest with every breath. Her body trembled in agony, still tingling from the brutal slashes Madame V had inflicted. But the pain was no longer the worst part. It was the overwhelming knowing, the knowledge that the nightmare was just beginning. The floor beneath her quivered, and the walls that had once seemed solid now pulsated in rhythm with her pounding heart. She realized, with a sickening clarity, that the room itself was alive, a living, breathing entity that thrived on the suffering within it. It was as though it was watching her, waiting for her to break. Her thoughts were a swirling, chaotic mess. The blood from her wounds no longer felt like it belonged to her, but to the room. Her reflection in the shattered mirror, if that was even her reflection, was a distorted version of herself. A grotesque mockery. The skin on her arms had peeled back in places, revealing raw, red flesh beneath, as if something deep inside her had begun to tear her apart from the inside. And then, the whispers began. At first, it was a low murmur, something distant, like a soft breeze moving through the trees. But it grew louder, sharper, more insistent. Rachel's name was spoken again and again, like an invocation, each whisper dripping with malice. "Rachel." The words crawled under her skin, sending chills down her spine. "Rachel, you belong here." Eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The voices filled her mind, twisting her thoughts, seeping into her very being. The walls of the room seemed to close in around her, the faces of the other dancers, now nothing more than distorted, broken bodies, crowded in, their hollow eyes locked on her. They watched her, not with pity, but with an insatiable hunger, as if they were waiting for her to join them. "No," Rachel whispered, her voice cracking. She didn't want to be a part of it. She didn't want to become one of them. But the darkness, the curse of the room, pressed down on her, and the whispers grew louder. "You'll dance forever," Madame V's voice purred. Cold and taunting. It seemed to come from everywhere, reverberating in her skull. "Forever. There's no escape." Rachel tried to push herself up, her legs weak and trembling, but the pain was unbearable. Every movement felt like 1,000 shards of glass scraping against her insides. She staggered to her feet, but the floor beneath her shifted, as if trying to swallow her whole. She screamed, but the sound was muffled, drowned out by the deafening roar of the blood-thumping music that had begun again, more twisted and chaotic than before. The killer's presence was like a shadow over her, always just behind her, watching, waiting. Rachel could feel her eyes on her back, the sick pleasure emanating from Madame V like a tangible force. The walls around her seemed to breathe with the killer's every movement, the air thick with tension. Suddenly, a horrible sound echoed through the room, the unmistakable scrape of metal against stone. Rachel turned her head just in time to see Madame V stepping toward her, the glint of the slasher tool, its blade now dripping with the blood of her friends, gleaming in the flickering candlelight. Madame V smiled, her lips curving with wicked delight. "You think you can escape me? You think you can run from this?" she purred, taking quick steps toward Rachel. "This is your fate now, my dear. This dance will never end." Rachel's breath hitched as she backed away, her body screaming in protest. But Madame V was too quick. In an instant, she was upon her, her hand locking around Rachel's wrist, pulling her forward with inhuman strength. The blade gleamed, so close to her skin, but it wasn't the blade that terrified her. It was the look in Madame V's eyes, a look that wasn't just murderous, but possessive. Like a lover claiming what was already hers, the blade came down. Rachel screamed in agony as the cold metal cut through her flesh. Her mind seemed to break, the pain too intense to process. She felt the world tilt. As though she were falling, but she couldn't move. The room was spinning, the walls blurring as the blood seeped from her body. The pain didn't stop. It only intensified, gnawing at her, tearing her apart in a slow, agonizing rhythm. Her skin burned, her muscles spasmed, and she couldn't tell where the pain ended and her consciousness began. The blood pooled around her, but it wasn't just hers. Her reflection in the mirror had changed again. This time, her eyes were wide and unblinking, her mouth stretched in a silent scream. She was no longer her, she was a part of the room now, a prisoner of the dance. And then, just as she thought she couldn't endure any more, Madame V's voice whispered in her ear. Soothing and soft, "This is only the beginning, my dear. We all must learn to dance, but you'll learn to lead." Rachel's vision swam as Madame V stepped back, her slasher tool dripping with blood. The woman's form wavered, flickering like a mirage, before solidifying once more, her wicked smile growing wider. "You'll learn to enjoy the dance," she whispered, her voice a lullaby in the midst of the chaos. Just like all the others, with a single, final, twisted laugh, Madame V vanished into the shadows, leaving Rachel alone in the blood-soaked room. As it continued to play, Rachel realized the truth. She was no longer alone. She had become one of them, lost in the endless dance of torment, her body twisted and broken, her mind unraveling. The music swirled around her once more, the rhythm too intoxicating, too consuming to ignore. She no longer fought it. She couldn't. The dance had claimed her, just as it had claimed all the others before her. As Rachel's bloodied hand trembled, she wiped the sweat from her brow, her breathing ragged. Her vision blurred, and her body screamed for release, but there was no escape, no way to break free. She stumbled back against the cold, jagged wall of the dance room, feeling the skin of her arms stick to the splintered wood. The music had stopped, and for a fleeting moment, there was a silence, an eerie, oppressive silence that sent a wave of dread crashing through her. But then came the whisper, soft, tempting, like a lover's caress in the darkness. "Rachel, you can't hide from me." She froze, feeling her heart hammer against her ribs. The voice was familiar. It was Madame V's. It was her own tormentor, the woman who had ripped apart her friends, turning their lives into nothing but a grotesque dance of death. But now something was wrong. Rachel's hand instinctively went to her stomach where the wound had been, but when her fingers touched the raw, mangled flesh, she recoiled. The skin was different. Her mind struggled to comprehend the sight. The flesh had become unnaturally smooth, almost gelatinous. Dark veins twisted beneath the surface, pulsing, as though something alive was growing inside her. She could feel it, hear it, a slow, rhythmic tapping from beneath her skin. The pain was still there, but it had transformed. It was no longer an excruciating wound, it was a part of her, growing deeper into her muscles, weaving itself into her bones. Something was inside her, something unnatural. And Rachel knew, with sick curse of this place, of the dance, was already altering her in ways she couldn't yet understand. She staggered forward, but her legs felt unsteady, as though the ground beneath her had turned into something soft and malleable. As if she were walking through thick mud. The room around her seemed to warp and shift, the walls bending, stretching with an impossible rhythm. Every movement she made was synchronized with the pulse beneath her skin. The darkness was swallowing her, tightening around her chest, suffocating her. And still, she danced. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Come, Rachel. You are one of us now. You will dance. Forever." Her mouth went dry, her fingers trembling as she reached for her side. Her skin was no longer flesh, it was something else, something that moved on its own accord. And before she could process it, a sickening snap echoed in her ears, followed by a stretch of tearing tissue. Her fingers slipped into her own flesh as if it were fabric, and she recoiled, gasping in horror. She pulled her hand back, but it wasn't blood that dripped from her fingers now, it was something thicker, blacker, a fluid that seemed to slither as it fell. "Let me help you," came the voice again, soft but sharp as a dagger's edge. Madame V emerged from the shadows, her silhouette glowing faintly with the dim, pulsating light. She moved like liquid, her steps flowing with a strange grace. The slasher tool in her hand reflecting the dull light, its gleaming blade hungry, Rachel tried to push herself away, but her legs betrayed her. Her body jerked in response to the rhythmic pulse that still thrummed beneath her skin, a force that didn't belong to her, wasn't hers to control. She could feel it moving through her, wrapping around her insides like a vine, twisting her, forcing her to remain. To dance, do you see it now, my dear? You can't escape. The dance is in your blood. It will make you beautiful. It will. Madame V stepped forward, her breath cold against Rachel's neck. Rachel turned her head, her mind swimming with fear, but before she could react, the slasher tool was already upon her, the blade glinting in the light. Slap, the metal bit into her skin, cutting along her jawline, the force of it so powerful that Rachel's body was forced backward into the wall with a sickening thud. She gasped, feeling her face go numb as blood poured from the wound. But even as her vision blurred, she could feel the change. Her body responded to the violence, the torturous embrace, with something otherworldly. She could feel the flesh knitting itself back together, twisting, reforming into something different. Something darker. Look at yourself, Madame V whispered, her voice soothing. You're becoming perfect, my dear. Beautiful. Strong. You'll dance forever with us. Rachel's reflection in the shattered mirror across the room stared back at her, a twisted version of herself. Her jaw had already begun to heal, the raw flesh knitting back into place, but the skin had turned a deep, sickly purple, stretching unnaturally over her bone. Her lips had darkened to a deep, blackish hue, and her eyes were wild, too wild, wide with terror and confusion, but now she could sense something else. Something horrifying. There was power in the reflection. Power in the twisted beauty of her own destruction. And then, before she could react, Madame V pushed her forward, forcing her in. The floor split open, revealing the blackness beneath, the space pulling her down, consuming her. Her reflection in the mirror began to move on its own, its lips moving silently as it stared back at her with that awful, mocking smile. Forever, Rachel. Forever, with us. Rachel's screams echoed in the room as the walls collapsed around her, her body torn and reformed, her flesh a living canvas of horror, as she was swallowed by the dance. The music became an all-consuming force, dragging her deeper into the madness, twisting her into something unrecognizable, something new. But as the music continued to play, Rachel realized the truth. She was no longer alone. She had become one of them, lost in the endless dance of torment, her body twisted and broken, her mind unraveling. The music swirled around her once more, the rhythm too intoxicating, too consuming to ignore. She no longer fought it. She couldn't. The dance had claimed her, just as it had claimed all the others before her. As Rachel's bloodied hand trembled, she wiped the sweat from her brow, her breathing ragged. Her vision blurred, and her body screamed for release, but there was no escape, no way to break free. She stumbled back against the cold, jagged wall of the dance room, feeling the skin of her arms stick to the splintered wood. The music had stopped, and for a fleeting moment. There was a silence, an eerie, oppressive silence that sent a wave of dread crashing through her, but then came the whisper, soft. Tempting. Like a lover's caress in the darkness, Rachel. You can't hide from me, she froze, feeling her heart hammer against her ribs. The voice was familiar. It was Madame V's. It was her own tormentor, the woman who had ripped apart her friends, turning their lives into nothing but a grotesque dance of death. But now something was wrong. Rachel's hand instinctively went to her stomach where the wound had been, but when her finger mangled flesh, she recoiled. The skin was different. Her mind struggled to comprehend the sight. The flesh had become unnaturally smooth, almost gelatinous. Dark veins twisted beneath the surface, pulsing, as though something alive was growing inside her. She could feel it, hear it, a slow, rhythmic tapping from beneath her skin. The pain was still there, but it had transformed. It was no longer an excruciating wound, it was a part of her, growing deeper into her muscles, weaving itself into her bones. Something was inside her, something unnatural. And Rachel knew, with sickening certainty, that the curse of this place, of the dance, was already altering her in ways she couldn't yet understand. She staggered forward, but her legs felt unsteady, as though the ground beneath her had turned into something soft and malleable. As if she were walking through thick mud. The room around her seemed to warp and shift, the walls bending, stretching with an impossible rhythm. Every movement she made was synchronized with the pulse beneath her skin. The darkness was swallowing her, tightening around her chest, suffocating her. Like liquid, her steps flowing with a strange grace, the slasher tool in her hand reflecting the dull light, its gleaming blade hungry. Rachel tried to push herself away, but her legs betrayed her. Her body jerked in response to the rhythmic pulse that still thrummed beneath her skin, a force that didn't belong to her, wasn't hers to control. She could feel it moving through her, wrapping around her insides like a vine, twisting her, forcing her to remain. To dance, do you see it now, my dear? You can't escape. The dance is in your blood. It will make you beautiful. It will make you perfect. With that, Madame V stepped forward, her breath cold against Rachel's neck. Rachel turned her head, her mind swimming with fear, but before she could react, the slasher tool was already upon her, the blade glinting in the light. Slap, the metal bit into her skin, cutting along her jawline, the force of it so powerful that Rachel's body was forced backward into the wall with a sickening thud. She gasped, feeling her face go numb as blood poured from the wound. But even as her vision blurred, she could feel the change. Her body responded to the violence, the torturous embrace, with something otherworldly. She could feel the flesh knitting itself back together, twisting, reforming into something different, something darker. Look at yourself, Madame V whispered. Her voice soothing. You're becoming perfect, my dear. Beautiful. Strong. You'll dance forever with us. Rachel's reflection in the shattered mirror across the room stared back at her, a twisted version of herself. Her jaw had already begun to heal, the raw flesh knitting back into place, but the skin had turned a deep, sickly purple, stretching unnaturally over her bone. Her lips had darkened to a deep, blackish hue, and her eyes were wild, too wild, wide with terror and confusion, but now she could sense something else. Something horrifying. There was power in the reflection, power in the twisted beauty of her own destruction, and then, before she could react, Madame V pushed her forward, forcing her back into the rhythm. The music started again, louder, more chaotic this time, almost feverish in its energy. Rachel's mind shattered as the room seemed to stretch and twist with every beat. She couldn't stop dancing. The music, the rhythm, the pulse beneath her skin, everything pushed her forward. Her body wasn't her own anymore. It moved on its own accord, faster, harder, forcing her to twist, to bend, to grind against the very air around her. The pain was there, but it was nothing compared to the euphoria that bloomed in her chest with every brutal step. Every tortured movement, but then, the horror twisted once again, the walls began to close in. The floor split open, revealing the blackness beneath, the space pulling her down, consuming her. Her reflection in the mirror began to move on its own, its lips moving silently as it stared back at her with that awful, mocking smile. Forever, Rachel. Forever, with us. Rachel's screams echoed in the room as the walls collapsed around her, her body torn and reformed, her flesh a living canvas of horror, as she was swallowed by the dance. The music became an all-consuming force, dragging her deeper into the madness, twisting her into something unrecognizable, something new. Rachel's breath was ragged. Her chest heaving as she collapsed to her knees, the room spinning around her. Her limbs felt like they were no longer her own, twitching unnaturally in sync with the relentless, eerie beat that filled the space. The blood that stained her skin had begun to crystallize, forming grotesque patterns across her body, as if her flesh were becoming a twisted work of art, a morbid masterpiece forged by pain and terror. her eyes flicked toward the shattered mirror that reflected her disfigured face. The skin around her jaw had healed, but it was wrong, twisted, stretched. Her once beautiful features were now distorted, warped into something grotesque. Something inhuman. But even as she stared at the monstrous version of herself, there was an undeniable pull. She could feel the rhythm deep in her bones, a rhythm that wanted her to dance, to move. The whispers returned, a symphony of voices in her mind, coaxing her, urging her to join them. "You're one of us now, Rachel. You can never leave. You'll dance with us, forever." She tried to stop, tried to close her eyes, to shut them all out. But it was too late. The dance had already begun to claim her, to bind her to it. Her feet were moving on their own, stepping forward, the floor beneath her shifting, changing in a strange and horrifying way. The walls were no longer solid, but fluid, pulsating as if the very building was alive, breathing with the music, with the rhythm. A sharp pain shot through her body, twisting her insides, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Rachel screamed. The sound was raw, animalistic, as if the pain of being reborn was finally breaking through the haze. She clawed at her own skin, trying to tear it off, to escape from the prison of flesh she now inhabited. But the more she pulled, the more her body responded. The wounds closed over, as if the skin itself was healing with each desperate attempt to destroy it. In that moment, she realized the truth. The curse of the dance wasn't just about the movement, it was about the transformation. The body that had once been hers was no longer hers. It was being remade into something new. Something terrible. Rachel's mind twisted in horror as she heard footsteps behind her. She turned to see Madame V, her eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The woman was smiling, her slasher tool gleaming in the dim, flickering light. "You're perfect, Rachel," Madame V said, her voice dripping with mock tenderness. "You've become one with us. You've become a part of the dance. Forever." Mind reeled. She had to fight it. She had to fight, but then something changed. As her hands clenched into fists, her body seized with a new, horrifying energy. She felt the music flow through her veins, pushing through her mind, bending her will. Her eyes widened as the horror dawned upon her. The dance wasn't just something imposed on her, it had become a part of her soul. It was no longer an external force. It was inside her, beating like a second heart. She was not just a victim. She was now the hunter. Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting shadows in every corner of the room. The music distorted, the tempo increasing to a maddening speed. Rachel's pulse quickened. And as she turned back toward Madame V, something inside her snapped. The woman before her, once so powerful, so terrifying, looked different now. She was no longer the predator. She was the prey. Before Madame V could react, Rachel moved with inhuman speed, her body contorting unnaturally as she lunged. The slasher tool in Madame V's hand was no match for Rachel's newfound strength. With a savage scream, Rachel tore the tool from her hands, the blood spraying across the room like a macabre fountain. Madame V stumbled back, her eyes wide with shock as she gazed at the twisted version of Rachel, her once beautiful victim, now a monstrous reflection of her former self. You were supposed to be mine." Madame V whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. Rachel's lips curled into a twisted smile, her eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction. "No. This dance is mine now." With one final, swift motion, she plunged the tool into Madame V's chest, the blade cutting through flesh and bone with sickening ease. The woman's body spasmed, her mouth opening in a silent scream, but there was no sound, only the pounding rhythm of the music, louder, faster. Madame V crumpled to the ground, her once formidable body now lifeless, her blood staining the music slowed, the relentless rhythm fading into silence, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Rachel could hear herself think again. Her body was still aching, still twitching with the aftereffects of the dance, but now, as she looked down at the blood-soaked floor, she felt free. Or was she? Rachel looked down at her hands, the blood now staining her fingers. Her body still felt foreign, alien. The rhythm still pulsed beneath her skin, like a steady drumbeat, as though it was a part of her now, something she could never escape. And then, from the shadows, came a soft, familiar voice. "You thought you were free, Rachel. But the dance is eternal. Once it's begun, it never ends." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She turned toward the voice. Standing in the doorway was the next one, another victim. Another dancer, and she knew, without a doubt, that the cycle would continue. That the last dance would never truly end, because in the end, the dance owns them all. The room began to pulse again, the music rising, pulling Rachel back into the rhythm. Her body, no longer hers, began to move once more, her feet stepping to a beat she could no longer fight.